The other day, I was scrolling through New Urbanist / New Traditionalist Twitter when I encountered this tweet by The Art of Purpose saying, "Why did we stop building beautiful cities?" With a picture of what looks like Copenhagen or Amsterdam, please correct me in the comments if I'm wrong, but either way, looks absolutely beautiful and viable. And is then compared to the relatively dull and lifeless urban landscape of what looks like a Chinese city. A reply from the host of Geography Now, Paul Barbarto, or Barbs, brings up a very interesting argument, however, saying, "Why do you insist the postmodern structure has no aesthetic value? Some actually do enjoy the sleek glass high-rises with the industrial grit overtones. It speaks of a time where people were charged with global innovation rather than local character." Now, before I continue, I just want to say that I'm a huge fan of Barbs and Geography Now, and if you're interested in fun and informative videos about, geography, I highly recommend Geography Now. I've been watching for several years at this point, and I'm still very much invested. From what I've seen over the years, Barbs is a very smart guy, and I respect whatever he has to say, so to see him give what is probably the strongest dissenting argument against the new urbanist / traditionalist movement made me think deeply about the issues that he brings up. And I think it's worth analyzing, as he will certainly not be the last person to make this point, as the movement aims to progress. So, with that being said, let's get into it. There is a simple way to address this. While there are spectacular modern structures around the world, such as the Eiffel Tower, the Walt Disney Concert Hall, the Sydney Opera House, Marina Bay Sands, and the Beijing National Stadium, these are amazing on their own and took artistic genius and prowess in order for the desired effect to be achieved. Your average modernist and postmodernist architect is not capable of innovating something as spectacular as these structures, which is why the vast majority of modernist architecture is ugly. While we all know the exceptions off the top of our heads, we shouldn't let the exception to the rule dictate the norm. The standard should always be what we know works, and this essentially is classical architecture. Look at any tourist video of any city with a mix of classical and traditional architecture with modernist architecture, and it is always the classical stuff that's on display. And these are the places that people put on a pedestal and spend a lot of money going to. When you think of the best image of Florence, do you think of this or this? And what about Paris, London, Japan, Turkey? The list goes on, and this applies essentially everywhere in the world. People follow traditional architecture wherever it is because it generally provides a better experience and quality of life. So, is there room for innovation, for exceptions to the ideal classical and traditional norm, for modernist buildings in new urbanism? Absolutely, as long as it lives up to a certain high standard, because the alternative is usually not very good. We should break the norm when making room for the genius and timeless works, but anything short of that comes off as a downgrade compared to a classical design. At least usually, but more on that later. Interestingly, I think there is reason to think that up until the last several decades, that's how things were always done. The exception was reserved for the spectacular. What defied the norm was few, but high in value. The Eiffel Tower is the most obvious example of this. What really makes the Eiffel Tower work isn't just its own beauty and grandiose, but its contrast to its surroundings. We all know and love the classical Ile-de-France architecture, but no one standard traditional Parisian building is at the center of attention. They serve as the backdrop to the showpiece, that being the Eiffel Tower, and this happens in other places too. The Duomo in Florence is probably my favorite example. Obviously, it is one of the most beautiful buildings in the world, but it does not follow the classical Florentine architecture. Its white color and highly detailed ornamentation completely contrasts the warmer, flatter look of the standard Tuscan structure. And before you guys say that choosing what is regarded as a classical building as an example for this is a mistake, just remember that they also built one of the first domes in several centuries, and what somehow continues to be the largest masonry dome in the world over 500 years later. Talk about innovation and breaking barriers in the right way. At the time, this was a great modern building that projected Florence into the Renaissance, and notice how it never became outdated. And to provide a more current example, the Sagrada Familia in Barcelona, which is still yet to be completed, also manages to be one of the most beautiful buildings in the world, while being very innovative despite its inauthenticity and strokes of modernism in contrast to classical Catalan architecture. Seriously, it somehow manages to be underrated despite its immense popularity. The 20th and 21st century can produce the divinely brilliant, but at the same time, the local corner shop looks like this. At least it's unique. And remember, the city of Florence doesn't all look like the Duomo. While a city like that, in my opinion, would be pretty cool, because of its unique and highly detailed design, that scenario certainly is much more a matter of taste, as this is what happens the more extreme and bold the design gets. And that's the other thing, having every building be entitled to a unique design and essentially a sport for even the below average architect to show off has led to streets and cities looking like a jumbled mess. Some buildings look better than others, but it's all over the place all the time, and there's a complete lack of identity on any level. Rather than having adopted a more global image, bringing us back to Barb's tweet, what we've actually got is just a conglomeration of individual taste. While looking at one building at a time online might make you appreciate each architect's artistic vision and design, when that's every single building with essentially no rules, for those on the ground level passing through, living their lives, it's an ugly mess that almost always is never built on the human scale, aiming to impress from an aerial shot rather than on the street. The standard building's job is not the job of these unique structures. You're going to be much better off with the average building in your city following a certain code and simple traditional standard, because that way, each street will satisfy almost everybody, rather than each building be adored by a few and disliked by most. And of course, this brings the environment together. With what we'll call the Eiffel Tower model, meeting a traditional standard with occasional modern masterpieces, there's room for global innovation, but more importantly, global innovation that boosts a local character. Even though the Eiffel Tower isn't classically French or Parisian in how it was designed, it is undoubtedly French, and we cannot think of Paris without thinking of it. This applies not just because of its aesthetics, but because it was designed with respect to the context of Paris. The Eiffel Tower, exactly as it is, wouldn't work as just some other building in downtown Manhattan. It may still have been highly regarded, but it certainly would not be what it is today as the centerpiece of Paris. The same will even go for a spectacular modern building that are in largely modernist cities, such as the Sydney Opera House. That kind of design would pass anywhere in the world, but is undoubtedly Australian and suits the Sydney Harbour. Examples of modern buildings that fail to work not just aesthetically, but in suiting the context of their environment are the Tower Blocks in London, or the Palace of the Republic in Berlin, which was rebuilt as the former Berlin Palace in a true victory for new traditionalism. Even the Bird's Nest Stadium in Beijing, while being amazing on its own, gets forgotten about in the postmodernist mess that is the current Chinese capital, showing the importance of a traditional standard in allowing these masterworks to thrive. So in conclusion, modernist and/or globalist buildings can and should have a place in the new urbanist vision of the world. They should stand out as the showstoppers and centerpieces in the traditional and classical landscape. Rather than being the personal tastes of the standard architect, they should be the great work of a genius architect, because you would much rather the standard work of the average architect in the typical urban street follow what we know works, rather than have them come up with something that absolutely doesn't. This way, you boost local character, while also contributing to the globally charged innovation in architecture, hitting both marks that Barb's outlines, rather than just choosing one. This keeps cities beautiful and on a human scale, while also allowing our buildings to propel us into the future and inspire us in future generations, which is what we all want, no matter where we find ourselves in this discussion on beauty and architecture. So, is there an exception to everything I've talked about? When does a modernist norm actually work? And what should we learn from these examples? That's what we'll discuss next time. Until then, goodbye, and hope you enjoyed the video.